The sun peeked over the hills surrounding the small town of Willow Creek, casting a warm, golden glow over its quiet streets. Birds chirped in the crisp morning air, and the soft clatter of shopkeepers opening their doors echoed faintly. But the most inviting sound came from the corner bakery, the gentle hum of an oven, the clang of trays being set, and the faint melody of Clara Harper humming to herself. Inside the cozy little shop, the smell of freshly baked bread, cinnamon rolls, and buttery croissants filled the air. It was the kind of aroma that could stop someone in their tracks and draw them inside without a second thought. Clara worked with steady hands, kneading dough and dusting pastries with sugar, a faint smile on her face. She looked exactly like what you'd expect from a baker. Her brown hair was tied back in a loose bun, with a few flour smudges on her cheeks and apron. Her eyes were soft, warm, and kind, and her voice rarely rose above a gentle tone. She didn't like standing out and preferred to let her baked goods do the talking. People in Willow Creek adored her for it. To the townsfolk, Clara was as much a part of their daily lives as the sun rising over the hills. If you'd had a bad day, Clara would hand you a slice of pie with a knowing smile and say, "This one's on the house." Everyone needs a little sweetness now and then. If you were celebrating, she'd whip up something extra special, adding a handwritten note or a flower as a finishing touch. Her kindness wasn't loud or flashy, it was simple, quiet, and steady like Clara herself. Yet for all the warmth she gave to others, Clara kept her past tightly locked away. No one knew much about her before she'd opened the bakery 5 years ago. When she'd first arrived in Willow Creek, she'd been just another face passing through town. But then she'd rented the old shop on the corner, transformed it into the bakery, and quickly became a beloved fixture of the community. People didn't pry. Why would they? Clara didn't seem like someone with secrets. She was humble and hard-working, always content to stay in the background. To them, she was just Clara the quiet baker. But every now and then, when she thought no one was looking, a different side of her peeked through. Her eyes would flicker with an intensity that didn't match her soft demeanor. Or her hands, so gentle with dough and frosting, would show a precision that seemed practiced. Still, no one questioned her. Why would they? Clara wasn't the kind of person anyone felt the need to worry about. But that peaceful morning was about to change. As Clara arranged a tray of freshly baked cinnamon rolls in the display case, she heard the low, rumbling growl of motorcycle engines. The sound grew louder, cutting through the calm morning like a storm rolling in. A knot tightened in Clara's stomach, but she didn't look up right away. The noise stopped abruptly, and a tense silence filled the air. Through the front window, Clara saw them, a line of gleaming motorcycles parked haphazardly along the curb, their chrome glinting in the sunlight. A group of men and women in black leather jackets dismounted, their boots hitting the pavement with heavy thuds. Clara glanced around the bakery. A few regulars were sitting at the small wooden tables, sipping coffee and nibbling on muffins. They looked toward the door, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Willow Creek wasn't the kind of town where bikers usually stopped. The door swung open, and the lead biker stepped inside. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a jagged scar running down one cheek and dark eyes that scanned the room like a predator sizing up its prey. Behind him, the rest of the group filed in, their presence filling the bakery with an almost tangible weight. "Smells good in here," the leader said, his voice low and gravelly. He leaned against the counter, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. Clara met his gaze briefly, her expression calm but guarded. "Thank you," she said softly. "What can I get for you?" The man smirked, his eyes flicking to the display case. "We'll take whatever's fresh," he said. His tone wasn't friendly, it was more of a command than a request. Clara nodded and began placing pastries into a box. She moved with her usual grace, but the air in the room felt heavier with each passing second. The regulars sat frozen at their tables, their eyes darting between Clara and the bikers. "Nice place you've got here," one of the other bikers said, running a hand along the counter. His fingers left smudges on the glass. "Thank you," Clara replied, her voice steady. The leader chuckled. "Polite, aren't you?" he said, leaning closer. "But tell me something. What's a quiet little baker like you doing in a town like this? Seems too small for someone like you." Clara's hands paused for just a moment before continuing to fill the box. "I like it here," she said simply. The leader's smirk widened. "Bet you do," he said. "Must be nice and peaceful. Wouldn't want anything to ruin that, would we?" Clara placed the box of pastries on the counter and rang up the total. "That'll be $20, she said. The leader raised an eyebrow. $20? Seems a bit steep, don't you think?" "It's the price," Clara said, her tone polite but firm. The man stared at her for a long moment before reaching into his pocket and tossing a crumpled bill onto the counter. "Keep the change," he said with a sneer. The group took their pastries and left, their laughter echoing as they mounted their motorcycles and roared away. Inside the bakery, the tension slowly eased, but the damage was done. Clara's regulars murmured amongst themselves, their voices low and uncertain. One of them, an elderly man named Walter, approached the counter. "You okay, Clara?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Clara smiled faintly. "I'm fine, Walter," she said. "Don't worry about me." But as she cleaned the counter and swept the floor, her mind was racing. The biker's visit wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a warning. And Clara knew better than anyone that warnings like that didn't come without reason. For the first time in years, Clara felt the walls of her carefully constructed life begin to crack. She had worked so hard to leave her past behind, to build something quiet and safe. But as the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that her peaceful life in Willow Creek was about to be turned upside down. She took a deep breath and steadied herself. Whatever was coming, she would face it. After all, Clara Harper wasn't just a baker. She never had been. The bell above the bakery door jingled softly as Clara locked it for the day, her fingers lingering on the cool brass handle. The golden light of the setting sun spilled across the empty street, painting the town in warm hues. She turned and leaned against the door, taking a moment to breathe in the silence that had returned after the biker's unsettling visit. Clara didn't scare easily. Years of living a life she rarely spoke of had taught her how to remain calm in the face of discomfort, even danger. But there was something about the leader of that group, the way his eyes seemed to dissect every inch of her bakery, the way he spoke in veiled threats that tugged at a thread she had worked so hard to bury deep within herself. The quiet baker in the corner shop wasn't supposed to have a past worth fearing. That was the whole point. She had built this life with care, every piece carefully placed like a fragile tower of cards. But today, for the first time in years, Clara wondered if the foundation was cracking. She stepped out into the cool evening air and made her way down the cobblestone street. The small town of Willow Creek had always felt like a safe haven. The people here were kind, the pace of life slow and predictable. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, where the biggest scandal was when the hardware store accidentally double-ordered a shipment of paint. Clara liked it that way. But tonight, as she walked past the rows of closed shops and neatly trimmed gardens, she felt a prickle of unease. The biker's laughter echoed in her mind, mingling with the memory of the leader's smirk. She replayed their brief conversation over and over, dissecting every word, every tone, every glance. Why had they come here? Willow Creek wasn't on any major route, and it didn't offer much beyond a picturesque main street and friendly faces. It wasn't the kind of place a biker gang would care about. Unless. Clara stopped in her tracks, her eyes narrowing as she considered the possibility. Unless they weren't here by chance. The next morning, Clara was back in the bakery well before dawn. The rhythm of baking soothed her, the familiar motions of kneading dough and mixing batter a kind of meditation. The sun rose slowly, bathing the kitchen in soft light as the first batch of bread emerged from the oven, golden and steaming. By the time the shop opened, Clara had shaken off some of the unease from the previous day. She greeted her regulars with her usual warm smile, handed out pastries, and chatted about the weather. But beneath the surface, her mind was anything but calm. "Morning, Clara," called Mrs. Henderson, the town's most talkative resident, as she stepped inside. She leaned on her cane and gave Clara a conspiratorial look. "Did you hear about those bikers yesterday? Quite the stir they caused." Clara smiled politely as she handed the elderly woman her usual loaf of sourdough. "Yes, I saw them," she said. "They stopped by here for some pastries." Mrs. Henderson gasped. "Oh, dear. Were they polite? You never know with those types." "They paid," Clara said simply, avoiding the woman's probing gaze. "Well, that's something," Mrs. Henderson huffed. "But I don't like it, Clara. Not one bit. Those kinds of people don't belong here." Clara didn't respond, instead busying herself with tidying the counter. She knew better than to fuel Mrs. Henderson's gossip mill. As the day went on, customers came and went, each of them bringing a little more normalcy back to the bakery. But as the afternoon wore on, Clara's sense of unease returned. She caught herself glancing out the window more often than usual, her hands pausing mid-task whenever the distant hum of an engine reached her ears. That evening, as Clara closed up shop, the street outside was quieter than usual. The townsfolk seemed to be keeping to their homes, a sense of tension lingering in the air. Clara carried the day's earnings to the small back room where she kept her ledger. The room was sparse, its shelves lined with jars of flour and sugar, a small desk tucked into the corner. But hidden beneath the desk, carefully locked away, was a box she hadn't opened in years. Her fingers brushed against the key in her apron pocket, hesitating. She knew what was inside, remnants of a life she had left behind, fragments of a person she no longer wanted to be. She pulled her hand away and locked the back room behind her. The bikers returned 3 days later. It was late morning, and the bakery was bustling with customers. Clara was in the middle of boxing up a dozen donuts when she heard the low growl of engines approaching. The room seemed to tense as the sound grew louder, cutting through the hum of conversation and the clinking of coffee cups. The leader was the first to step inside, his scar catching the light as he scanned the room. He didn't smirk this time. Instead, his expression was unreadable, his dark eyes flicking briefly to Clara before he nodded to the others. They spread out, their heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor. One leaned against the wall, arms crossed, while another casually inspected the pastries in the display case. Clara set the box of donuts on the counter and met the leader's gaze. "Back again?" she asked evenly. He tilted his head, his lips curving into a small smile. "Told you your pastries were good," he said. Clara didn't respond. She kept her expression neutral, her hands steady as she placed the next customer's order into a bag. The room was quiet, the usual chatter replaced by an uneasy silence. Clara could feel the weight of the biker's presence pressing down on her, but she refused to let it show. The leader stepped closer to the counter. "You know," he said, his voice low, "this is a nice little town you've got here. Real quiet. Real peaceful." Clara met his gaze, her eyes steady. "That's why I like it," she said. He chuckled softly. "Bet you do," he said. "Shame if something were to disturb that peace." The tension in the room was palpable. Clara could feel the eyes of her customers on her, could sense their unease. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her posture and said, "I run a bakery. If you're here for pastries, I'd be happy to help. If not, I think it's time you moved on." For a moment, the leader just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, Slowly, he smiled. "Pastries it is," he said. After the bikers left, Clara closed the shop early. She sat at one of the empty tables, her hands clasped tightly around a mug of tea. She stared at the door, her mind racing. It wasn't just a coincidence. They were targeting her bakery for a reason. And Clara had a sinking feeling that the quiet life she had built in Willow Creek was about to crumble. The bakery was alive with the usual warmth that Clara Harper had cultivated over the years. Customers sat at tables enjoying their coffee, children picked out colorful cookies from the display case, and the scent of fresh bread hung in the air like a comforting embrace. Clara worked behind the counter, her movements fluid and precise, her smile kind and reassuring. The atmosphere changed the moment the door swung open. The group of bikers strode in like they owned the place, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. The leader, his jagged scar catching the morning light, scanned the room with a predatory smirk. Behind him, the others fanned out, their leather jackets creaking as they moved. Clara noticed the sudden stillness among her regulars. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and the cheerful clinking of coffee cups faded into an uneasy silence. Clara's hands paused briefly as she wiped the counter, but she quickly resumed her work, refusing to let her unease show. The leader leaned on the counter, his presence dominating the space. He tapped the glass display case with a thick finger, leaving smudges on the spotless surface. "What do you recommend, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Clara met his gaze, her expression calm but unreadable. "Everything here is good," she replied softly. "What would you like?" The man's smirk widened. "Everything, huh? That's a bold claim." He straightened up and looked over his shoulder at his crew. "What do you think, boys? Should we test her out?" The bikers chuckled, their laughter filling the small bakery like the rumble of distant thunder. One of them reached into the display case without waiting for permission, grabbing a croissant and biting into it. He chewed slowly, his expression exaggeratedly thoughtful. "Not bad," he said, spraying crumbs as he spoke. "But not worth paying for." He tossed the half-eaten pastry onto the counter, where it left a greasy stain on Clara's clean surface. Clara's heart pounded, but her face remained composed. "If you'd like to sample something, I can offer you a free taste," she said, her voice steady. "But if you take something, I'll have to ask you to pay for it." The leader chuckled darkly and leaned closer, his scarred face inches from hers. "And what if we don't feel like paying, huh? What are you gonna do about it?" Clara didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a calmness that seemed to unsettle him. "This is a business," she said simply. "And I treat everyone fairly. I expect the same in return." For a moment, the leader seemed caught off guard by her quiet strength. But then he laughed, a harsh, barking sound that made the regulars in the room flinch. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, straightening up. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." He reached for the coffee pot on the counter, pouring himself a cup without asking. He took a sip, then made a face of exaggerated disgust and tossed the cup onto the floor. The dark liquid spilled across the tiles, pooling at Clara's feet. "You call that coffee?" he barked. The other bikers howled with laughter, their jeers echoing off the bakery's walls. One of them grabbed a tray of cookies and dumped them onto the counter, crumbs scattering everywhere. "We don't pay for garbage," he sneered, biting into a cookie and spitting it onto the floor. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she bent down to clean the spilled coffee, but her movements were deliberate and controlled. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. As she straightened up, one of the bikers knocked over a chair, the crash startling a little girl sitting with her mother in the corner. The mother pulled her child close, her eyes wide with fear. "Please," Clara said, her voice soft but firm. "There are children here. Let's keep this civil." The leader snorted and took a step closer to her. Civil? Sweetheart, you don't get it, do you? We don't play by your rules. The room fell deathly silent as Clara stood up straight and looked him in the eye. For the first time, her calm demeanor gave way to something sharper, a flicker of cold steel behind her gaze. No, she said softly. You don't play by my rules. But this is my bakery, and in here, you respect my rules or you leave. The leader's smirk faltered for a split second, replaced by a flicker of something that might have been doubt. But he recovered quickly, his bravado returning as he leaned in closer. You're brave, I'll give you that, he said, his voice low. But bravery only gets you so far. He turned to his crew, nodding toward the door. Come on, boys. We've got better places to be. The bikers filed out one by one, their laughter lingering in the air long after the door swung shut. The leader was the last to leave. He paused in the doorway, glancing back at Clara with a look that promised trouble. This ain't over, sweetheart, he said. Then he was gone, the roar of their motorcycles fading into the distance. The bakery was quiet once more, but the damage had been done. Chairs lay overturned, crumbs and coffee stains marred the once pristine floor, and the regulars sat frozen at their tables, their faces pale. Clara took a deep breath and began cleaning up the mess, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Walter, one of her oldest customers, approached the counter hesitantly. Clara, are you all right? He asked, his voice shaky. Clara offered him a faint smile. I'm fine, Walter, she said. Just a little mess to clean up. Walter frowned. Those men, they're trouble. You should call the sheriff. Clara shook her head. It's fine, she said. I can handle it. But as she wiped the counter and swept the floor, Clara's mind raced. The bikers weren't just causing trouble for the sake of it. They had come to her bakery for a reason, and she had a sinking feeling she knew why. She had spent years hiding, years building a life that was quiet and safe. But now, it seemed, her past was catching up with her. Clara paused, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. The regulars might have seen a meek, quiet baker who refused to back down out of sheer stubbornness. But Clara knew better. This wasn't stubbornness. This was strategy. Because while the bikers saw her as an easy target, Clara knew something they didn't. She wasn't just a baker. And if they pushed her too far, they would find out exactly what that meant. The tension in Willow Creek didn't fade after the bikers' visit. News of the incident spread quickly, as things always did in small towns, and Clara found herself fielding concerned questions from customers and neighbors alike. Did they hurt you? Are they coming back? Should we be worried? Clara gave the same answers to everyone, I'm fine. They were just passing through. There's no need to worry. But deep down, she knew better. The leader's parting words echoed in her mind, this ain't over. She spent her evenings alone in the bakery, going over every detail of the encounter. She replayed their words, their actions, the way they moved and spoke. And with each passing day, her suspicion grew stronger. This wasn't random. The bikers hadn't chosen her bakery by chance. They were sending a message. And Clara Harper was determined to find out why. The following morning, Clara arrived at the bakery even earlier than usual. The dawn sky was a muted gray, and the streets of Willow Creek were still and quiet. She unlocked the front door, stepping into the familiar warmth of her shop. But today, the sense of peace she usually found here felt distant. As she went through the motions of kneading dough and prepping the ovens, her mind replayed the bikers' visit. Their mocking laughter, the leader's smug threats, the spilled coffee, it was all too fresh in her memory. She glanced at the spotless counter where the mess had been. It was as if the events of the day before hadn't happened at all. Except Clara knew better. By mid-morning, the bakery was bustling again, and for a moment, Clara almost believed everything had returned to normal. The scent of cinnamon rolls wafted through the air, children giggled as they debated which cookie to choose, and customers chatted over steaming cups of coffee. Then the sound came. The distant growl of engines. The noise grew louder, and the atmosphere inside the bakery shifted. Conversations trailed off, and a nervous murmur rippled through the room. Clara looked up from the register just as the door swung open, the bell jingling in a way that felt strangely menacing. They were back. The leader strode in first, his scarred face split into a crooked grin. His crew followed close behind, their leather jackets and heavy boots seeming to absorb all the warmth in the room. Well, the leader drawled, scanning the bakery. Looks like business is booming. Clara forced herself to remain calm, her expression neutral. Can I help you? She asked, her tone steady. The leader chuckled, leaning on the counter like he had the day before. Help us? Sure, sweetheart. We'll take a little something for the road. On the house, of course. His crew erupted in laughter, the sound grating and unpleasant. One of them grabbed a loaf of bread from the display, tearing into it without a second thought. Another swiped a handful of cookies, crumbs spilling onto the floor as he shoved them into his mouth. Clara's regulars sat frozen at their tables, their eyes darting nervously between Clara and the bikers. You're welcome to buy anything you'd like, Clara said evenly, ignoring the growing knot in her stomach. But I don't give away food for free. The leader's grin faded, his eyes narrowing. Is that so? He said, his voice low. He reached out, plucking a fresh muffin from the counter. He held it up, inspecting it like it was some sort of prize, then took a slow, deliberate bite. This one's on the house, he said, his tone challenging. Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She simply turned away and began wiping the counter, her movements deliberate and calm. The leader watched her for a moment, then leaned in closer. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. But you're making a mistake. Clara straightened, meeting his gaze. The only mistake I'm making is letting you ruin my customer's day, she said quietly. The room went silent. For a long moment, the leader stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he laughed, the sound harsh and grating. You've got fire, sweetheart, he said, stepping back. I like that. He turned to his crew, jerking his head toward the door. Let's go, boys. We'll let the little baker cool off. The bikers filed out, their laughter lingering in the air like a bad smell. The leader was the last to leave. He paused in the doorway, looking back at Clara with a smirk. See you around, he said, his tone laced with menace. The door slammed shut behind him, and the bakery was quiet once more. After they left, Clara locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. She turned to her remaining customers, who were still seated in stunned silence. I'm sorry for the disturbance, she said, her voice calm but firm. I think it's best if we call it a day. The customers nodded, gathering their things and leaving quickly. Some of them offered her concerned glances on their way out, but Clara didn't acknowledge them. Once the bakery was empty, she sat down at one of the tables, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her mind raced with questions. Why were they targeting her? What did they want? She thought about the leader's smirk, the way he spoke to her as if he knew something she didn't. She thought about the way his crew had torn through her bakery, taking whatever they wanted without a second thought. And she thought about the warning in his eyes as he left, this isn't over. Clara closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She had worked too hard to build this life, to create something safe and stable. She wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her. Not again. The next morning, Clara opened the bakery as usual. She greeted her regulars with her usual warm smile, handing out pastries and chatting about the weather. but beneath the surface, her mind was anything but calm. She caught herself glancing out the window more often than usual, her hands pausing mid-task whenever she heard the distant rumble of an engine. Her regulars noticed the change. Walter, her oldest customer, approached the counter with a concerned frown. "Clara, are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. Clara hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'm fine, Walter," she said. "Just a little tired, that's all." Walter didn't look convinced, but he didn't press her. He simply took his coffee and sat down at his usual table, watching her carefully. By mid-afternoon, the bakery was quiet. Most of the morning rush had come and gone, leaving Clara with a few hours of peace. She took the opportunity to tidy up the shop, wiping down tables and restocking the display case. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced out the window, but the street outside was empty. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. She was just on edge after the biker's visit. But the feeling persisted. When the door swung open, Clara's heart leapt into her throat. It wasn't the bikers. It was Sheriff Tom Stanton, his broad frame filling the doorway. He removed his hat as he stepped inside, his expression serious. "Clara," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk." Clara's hand stilled on the counter. "What's this about, Sheriff?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Tom hesitated, glancing around the empty bakery before stepping closer. "It's about those bikers," he said. Clara's heart sank. "What about them?" she asked. Tom leaned on the counter, his expression grim. "They're not just passing through," he said. "They've been spotted in a few towns nearby, causing trouble wherever they go. And from what I've heard, they've got their sights set on Willow Creek." Clara's stomach turned. "Why here?" she asked. Tom shrugged. "Could be anything. Maybe they see a small town like ours as an easy target. Or maybe it's something specific." He looked at her carefully. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Clara hesitated, her mind racing. "I don't know why they're here," she said finally. "But I'm not going to let them scare me away." Tom nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Just be careful, Clara," he said. "These guys don't play fair. And if you need help, you know where to find me." Clara watched him leave, her thoughts a whirlwind. The bikers weren't just passing through. They were here for a reason. And Clara had a sinking feeling that reason had something to do with her. The next morning, the bakery opened as usual. Clara greeted her customers with the same warm smile and friendly demeanor she always had, but the air around her carried a quiet tension. She could feel the weight of the previous days lingering like a shadow. The bikers had been coming regularly now, their visits growing more frequent and disruptive. It was no longer an occasional nuisance, it had become a pattern. And Clara knew patterns like this didn't fade without intervention. It started small. One of the bikers swaggered in just after the morning rush, his boots leaving muddy imprints across the freshly mopped floor. He helped himself to a pastry, tearing into it without a word. When Clara approached the counter to ring up his purchase, he leaned back with a smug grin. "You expecting me to pay for this?" he asked, crumbs tumbling from his mouth. Clara met his gaze evenly. "That's how it works in a bakery," she said calmly. "You buy something, you pay for it." The biker chuckled, tossing the half-eaten pastry onto the counter. "Keep the change," he said mockingly, flipping her a single coin before sauntering out. It wasn't about the money, Clara reminded herself. It was about control. The next day, they returned in full force. This time, they came during the lunch rush, their loud entrance startling the patrons. One of the bikers knocked over a display of muffins as he walked by, laughing as the baked goods scattered across the floor. "Oops," he said with exaggerated innocence. Guess I'm just clumsy today. Another leaned against the counter, his leather jacket creaking as he smirked at Clara. We figured we'd come back for seconds, he said. Hope you don't mind. Clara said nothing, her expression blank as she bent down to pick up the spilled muffins. The customers watched nervously, some whispering among themselves. A few stood to leave, but the leader blocked the door, his arms crossed. Don't go rushing off, he said with a grin. We're just getting started. The tension in the room was suffocating. Clara could feel the bikers' eyes on her as she cleaned, their mocking laughter echoing in her ears. But she didn't flinch, didn't let them see how her heart raced or how her hands itched to do something other than wipe crumbs off the floor. Instead, she straightened and returned to the counter, her movements deliberate. Are you here to buy anything? She asked, her voice calm. The leader tilted his head, pretending to think. Nah, he said finally. We're just here to enjoy the atmosphere. Behind the scenes, Clara had started making changes. Late at night, long after the bakery had closed, she stayed behind. The warm glow of the ovens was replaced by the cold glint of steel. Hidden beneath the bakery's cozy exterior was a small storage room, its contents known only to Clara. It was here that she worked, her hands moving with a precision that spoke of years of experience. Tools lay spread out before her: knives, locks, and other items that didn't belong in a kitchen. She inspected each one carefully, her movements practiced and deliberate. A blade that hadn't been sharpened in years now gleamed under the dim light. A lockpick set, tucked away in the corner of an old box, was carefully oiled and tested. As she worked, her mind wandered. She thought about her past, about the years she had spent building this life. She thought about the bikers, their threats, and their laughter. And she thought about the moment when they would push too far. The next morning, Clara was sweeping the front steps of the bakery when she noticed something unusual. A sleek black motorcycle was parked across the street, its chrome details gleaming in the sunlight. She didn't recognize it, but she didn't need to. The engine roared to life as soon as she looked up, the sound echoing through the quiet street. The rider, clad in black leather and a mirrored helmet, revved the engine once before speeding off. Clara watched it disappear into the distance, her grip tightening on the broom handle. The harassment escalated. One afternoon, the bikers barged in and began tipping over tables and chairs, their laughter filling the small shop. One of them grabbed a bag of flour from the counter, tearing it open and throwing the contents into the air like confetti. The cloud of white powder settled over the room, coating the tables, the floor, and even Clara herself. You should really clean this place up, one of them said, grinning. Clara's regulars had stopped coming. The bakery, once lively and full of chatter, now felt empty and hollow. Even Sheriff Stanton had begun checking in more often, his concern evident every time he stepped through the door. Clara, he said one evening, his voice low. You need to let me handle this. These guys aren't going to stop until you stand up to them. Clara shook her head. I've handled worse, she said simply. Tom frowned. You shouldn't have to handle this at all, he said. Clara didn't respond. What the bikers didn't know, what no one in Willow Creek knew, was that Clara Harper wasn't always a baker. Her quiet demeanor, her unassuming nature, the way she avoided confrontation, it was all part of a life she had carefully constructed. But there were cracks in the facade, small moments where her old self peeked through. The way she moved with a quiet confidence, her sharp eyes catching every detail, the way her hands never shook even under pressure. Late one night, as she sat in the storage room polishing a set of throwing knives, she allowed herself to remember. She remembered the years she had spent training, the missions that had taken her across the world, the countless identities she had adopted. She remembered the moment she had decided to leave it all behind, to trade the chaos for the simplicity of a small-town life. And she remembered why. The next day, the bikers returned. This time, they didn't bother with subtlety. They stormed in, overturning tables and smashing plates, their laughter loud and grating. Clara stood behind the counter, her expression calm as she watched them wreak havoc. The leader approached her, his scarred face twisted into a grin. "Still think you can ignore us?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Clara met his gaze, her eyes cold. "I'm not ignoring you," she said quietly. The leader's grin faltered, just for a moment. Then he laughed, the sound harsh and hollow. "Good," he said. "Because we're just getting started." Later that night, Clara locked the front door and pulled down the blinds. She walked to the back of the bakery, her footsteps echoing in the silence. In the storage room, she opened a drawer and pulled out a small, worn notebook. Inside were pages filled with handwritten notes and diagrams, each one meticulously detailed. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the familiar words. This wasn't just about protecting her bakery. This was about sending a message. The bikers didn't know it, but they had crossed an invisible line. That night, Clara lingered in the bakery long after closing. The cozy warmth of the ovens was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Outside, the street lights flickered, and the town settled into its quiet routine. But inside, something was brewing. Clara opened the drawer beneath the counter and retrieved an object she hadn't touched in years, a small, unassuming leather pouch. Its weight was familiar in her hands, a reminder of the person she had once been. She unrolled it on the counter, revealing a collection of tools. Lockpicks, miniature blades, and a penlight. Ordinary items to anyone else, but Clara knew their potential. Her fingers brushed over each tool, her mind replaying lessons from a life she had buried deep. The next morning, Clara arrived early to assess the damage from the previous day. Flour still dusted the floors, chairs were overturned, and one of the windows bore a faint crack. She didn't waste time dwelling on it. Instead, she began cleaning, her movements deliberate and purposeful. As she worked, she noticed something. A chair leg, snapped in half, revealed a hollow interior. Clara examined it closely, her eyes narrowing. It wasn't the bikers who had caused this particular damage. The cut was too precise, too clean. Her instincts flared a sense she hadn't needed in years. She glanced around the bakery, her sharp eyes scanning for anything out of place. A misplaced jar, a slight shift in the position of a display shelf, tiny details no one else would notice. Someone else had been here. The bikers' visits became more frequent, almost daily. They seemed to delight in testing Clara's patience, pushing boundaries to see how far she would bend before she broke. One afternoon, as Clara served a pair of customers, the leader of the group strode in and leaned on the counter. His grin was as sharp as the scar on his face. "Business looks slow," he said, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. "Must be hard to make a living in a place like this." Clara didn't respond immediately. She finished serving her customers, handing them their pastries with a smile, and watched as they exited quickly, casting nervous glances at the bikers. "I manage," Clara said finally, her tone neutral. The leader chuckled. "Oh, I don't doubt that. But see, I was thinking," he paused, looking around the bakery. "Maybe you could use some help. You know, someone to protect your investment." The room fell silent. Clara felt the weight of his words, the thinly veiled threat beneath the surface. "I appreciate the offer," she said evenly, her hands steady as she wiped down the counter. "But I don't need protection." The leader's grin faltered for a fraction of a second. Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You sure about that?" That evening, as Clara closed up, the weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders. The bikers were escalating, and the cracks in her carefully constructed life were widening. She couldn't ignore it any longer. After locking the doors, Clara retreated to the storage room. She pulled out an old duffel bag and unzipped it. Inside were items that had no place in a bakery: black gloves, a coiled rope, and a set of well-worn boots. She slipped on the gloves and tied her hair back, her movements precise and practiced. As she reached for a small, silver pendant hanging around her neck, her fingers paused. The pendant was shaped like a key, unassuming but significant. She closed her eyes, gripping it tightly. Underscore 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 on. The following morning, Clara arrived at the bakery to find a motorcycle parked out front. It wasn't one of the sleek, polished bikes the gang usually rode. This one was older, its paint chipped and its handlebars worn. The rider sat astride it, helmet on, and didn't move as Clara approached. She could feel their eyes on her, even through the reflective visor. Clara ignored them, unlocking the door and stepping inside. She didn't have time for distractions. But as the day wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Underscore 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 on. The bikers returned that afternoon, louder and more disruptive than ever. They overturned tables, smashed a plate, and knocked over a display of cookies. Clara stood silently behind the counter, her expression unreadable. She watched as the leader grabbed a loaf of bread and tore into it, scattering crumbs everywhere. "You know," he said, his mouth full, "this bread isn't half bad. Maybe we'll keep you around." The others laughed, their voices grating against Clara's nerves. "Thank you," Clara said calmly, her voice betraying no emotion. The leader frowned, clearly expecting a different reaction. He leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. "You're awfully calm for someone in your position," he said. Clara met his gaze, her expression steady. "I've learned not to waste energy on things that don't matter," she said simply. For a moment, the leader said nothing. Then he laughed, the sound harsh and hollow. "We'll see how long that lasts," he said, stepping back. Underscore 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 on. As the bikers left, Clara's mind was already working. She replayed every word, every action, every detail. She had seen the way the leader's hand twitched, the way his gaze lingered on the cash register. They were planning something. That night, Clara stayed late again. This time, she focused on the bakery itself. She checked the locks on the doors and windows, testing their strength. She examined the layout of the shop, noting every point of entry and exit. Then she went to the back room. From a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, she retrieved an object wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small, unmarked handgun. Clara held it for a moment, her grip steady. Then she set it aside and returned to the workbench, where a set of tools awaited her. Underscore 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 on. The next day, Clara opened the bakery as usual. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls filled the air, and the morning sun streamed through the windows. But there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that something was about to happen. The bikers arrived just before lunch, their presence as disruptive as ever. But this time, they weren't alone. The rider from the old motorcycle entered behind them, their helmets still on. The bikers didn't seem to notice or care, too busy knocking over chairs and laughing at their own antics. Clara, however, noticed. She watched the rider carefully, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Something was about to change. The bakery stood silent, bathed in the warm glow of evening light. Flour dusted the air, settling on the countertops and floor like the remnants of an earlier storm. Outside, the rumble of motorcycles shattered the stillness. Clara stood behind the counter, her apron neatly tied, her expression calm. Her hands rested lightly on the wooden surface, but her sharp eyes were fixed on the door. She had been waiting for this. The gang stormed in, led by the scar-faced man whose grin was as crooked as his sense of decency. His boots thudded against the wooden floor as he kicked the door open wide, letting the chilly night air seep into the bakery. The other bikers filed in behind him, their laughter loud and grating, filling the space with tension. Well, the leader drawled, surveying the room like he already owned it. The quiet baker herself. Guess you didn't get the message, huh? Clara tilted her head slightly, her calm gaze meeting his. I got the message, she said, her voice as even as the surface of a still pond. The leader's grin widened. Good. Makes this easier. He snapped his fingers, and one of the bikers stepped forward, dragging a metal crowbar behind him. The tool scraped against the floor, the sound sharp and grating. The man swung it lazily at a nearby chair, splintering the wood with a loud crack. Consider this your last warning, the leader said, his tone mockingly patient. Hand over the keys to this dump, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here in one piece. The other bikers laughed, their voices bouncing off the walls. One of them grabbed a tray of freshly baked pastries and hurled it across the room, sending crumbs and icing splattering onto the floor. Clara didn't flinch. She watched them with an unnerving stillness, her hands clasped in front of her. I don't think you understand, she said softly. This isn't your bakery. It's mine. And you're not welcome here. The leader's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, leaning on the counter to close the distance between them. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he sneered. But guts won't get you far when you're outnumbered. He gestured to his men, who spread out across the room, knocking over chairs and overturning tables. The sound of wood scraping against tile echoed loudly, but Clara remained unfazed. The leader reached for her arm, his hand moving with the confidence of someone who believed no one would ever stop him. But he was wrong. The room changed in an instant. Clara's hand shot out, faster than anyone could react, her fingers gripping the leader's wrist with surprising strength. The smug look on his face disappeared as she twisted his arm, forcing him to step back with a grunt of pain. The other bikers froze, their laughter replaced by confusion. I warned you, Clara said, her voice low and firm. She released the leader's arm and stepped back, reaching under the counter. When her hand re-emerged, it held something none of them expected, a sleek black baton, its surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The leader rubbed his wrist, his expression darkening. What's this? He snarled. You think that little stick's gonna stop us? Clara didn't respond. She pressed a button on the side of the baton, and with a sharp click, it extended to its full length. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, but the leader barked out a laugh. She's got a toy, he scoffed. Big deal. Get her. Two of the bikers lunged toward Clara, their heavy boots pounding against the floor. But Clara was already moving. Her first strike was swift and precise, the baton connecting with the nearest biker's knee. He cried out as his leg buckled, collapsing to the ground. Before the second man could react, Clara spun on her heel, the baton whistling through the air and landing a solid blow against his ribs. The remaining bikers hesitated, clearly startled by the sudden turn of events. Clara didn't give them time to regroup. She vaulted over the counter with an agility that left them stunned, landing lightly on her feet. The baton twirled in her hand like an extension of her arm, every movement fluid and deliberate. You don't know who you're dealing with, Clara said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The leader snarled, reaching for the knife tucked into his belt. He pulled it free and lunged at her, his movements clumsy compared to hers. Clara sidestepped easily, her movements almost graceful. She swung the baton in a sharp arc, knocking the knife from his hand with a metallic clang. He stumbled back, his confidence unraveling. The remaining bikers regrouped, surrounding Clara in a tight circle. They thought they had the advantage, but they were wrong. Clara's eyes flicked between them, her mind calculating every possible move. Her past had prepared her for this: every lesson, every drill, every sleepless night spent honing her skills. One of the bikers charged, a broken chair leg raised like a club. Clara ducked under the swing, her baton snapping up to strike him in the jaw. He crumpled to the ground, groaning. Another tried to grab her from behind, but she twisted free, spinning around to deliver a sharp kick to his chest. The leader watched, his jaw clenched, as his men fell one by one. "This isn't over," he growled, backing toward the door. Clara's gaze locked onto him, her expression cold. "Oh, it's over," she said. She raised the baton, her stance unwavering. "Get out," she ordered. "And don't come back." For a moment, the leader hesitated, his pride warring with his sense of self-preservation. Then he turned and bolted, his remaining men scrambling to follow. The roar of motorcycles filled the air as the gang sped away, their retreat as chaotic as their arrival. As the noise faded, Clara lowered the baton, her breathing steady. She surveyed the room, taking in the overturned tables and scattered debris. The bakery was a mess, but it was hers. And she had made it clear that no one would take it from her. Clara returned to the counter, placing the baton on the surface with a quiet clink. She straightened her apron and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. The bakery felt quiet again, the tension dissipating like steam rising from a freshly baked loaf of bread. Clara allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. They wouldn't be back. And if they ever dared to return, they'd find themselves facing more than just a quiet baker. The aftermath of Clara's swift defense left the bakery in an eerie silence. The faint sound of a bell jingling above the door as it swung shut behind the retreating bikers was the only indication of their hasty escape. For the first time in weeks, the warm and inviting scent of baked goods reclaimed the air, pushing away the stale tension that had clung to the space. Clara stood still for a moment, her baton now resting on the counter, its polished surface gleaming in the soft light. Her breathing was measured, her sharp eyes scanning the room, noting every overturned chair, every shattered piece of glass, and every pastry squashed under heavy boots. She didn't flinch. Instead, she walked slowly around the bakery, methodically putting things back in order. As she worked, her movements were deliberate, but her mind churned. She had exposed herself, her skills, her past. And while the immediate threat had been neutralized, she knew the storm was far from over. People like that leader, Scarface, didn't just walk away. They regrouped. They retaliated. Clara wasn't naive enough to believe this would be the end of it. The next morning, the townsfolk began to trickle into the bakery, their cautious faces peeking around the doorframe. Word of the confrontation had spread quickly: how Clara Harper, the quiet baker, had taken down a gang of bikers single-handedly. A local farmer, Mr. Thompson, was the first to speak. "Clara, I heard about what happened," he said, his voice tinged with both awe and worry. "You all right?" Clara looked up from the counter where she was kneading dough, her expression as calm as ever. "I'm fine, Mr. Thompson," she said softly. "Just a little excitement, that's all." "A little excitement." Mrs. Hargrove, the town's gossip, piped up from behind him. "You took on a gang of thugs. Where did you learn to do all that? What kind of baker knows how to fight like that?" Clara smiled politely, brushing a bit of flour off her hands. "Sometimes, life teaches you skills you don't expect to use," she said cryptically, her tone leaving no room for further questions. But the questions didn't stop. As more customers came in, curiosity buzzed like a swarm of bees. People speculated wildly about who Clara really was. A former soldier? A martial arts instructor? Some even whispered about spy work or mercenary jobs. Clara let them talk, saying nothing to confirm or deny the rumors. She preferred it that way. The less they knew, the safer they'd be. Late that night, after the last loaf had been placed on the cooling rack and the bakery's lights were dimmed, Clara moved with a different purpose. She locked the front door and descended into the basement, a space she rarely visited but had always kept meticulously organized. The air was cool and slightly musty, carrying the faint scent of metal and oil. Clara flipped a switch, and a single bulb flickered to life, casting a yellowish glow over the room. The basement was nothing like the cozy bakery above. A sturdy workbench dominated the space, cluttered with tools that weren't meant for baking: steel wire, precision cutters, and a few disassembled gadgets. Mounted on the walls were shelves lined with small, locked cases. Clara approached one of these, her fingers brushing over its surface before she unlocked it with a code only she knew. Inside lay an assortment of items that spoke volumes about her past: throwing knives, a compact crossbow, and a set of old dog tags with the name scratched out. Clara hesitated for a moment, staring down at the contents. It had been years since she'd touched these tools, years since she'd stepped away from that part of her life. But now, it seemed, the past had found her again. "I didn't want this," she murmured to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if they want a fight, they'll get one." Days passed without any sign of the bikers, but Clara didn't let her guard down. She kept a watchful eye on the street, noting unfamiliar vehicles and faces. The bakery returned to its usual rhythm, with customers chatting over coffee and pastries, but the sense of unease lingered beneath the surface. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Willow Creek, the distant growl of motorcycles echoed once again through the streets. Clara didn't look up from where she was arranging loaves of bread on the display shelf. Her ears caught the sound immediately: 6, no, 7 engines, heavier than before. They were back, and this time, they weren't alone. The bell above the door jingled, and Scarface entered, flanked by a dozen men. These weren't the same bikers as before. They were larger, meaner, and their eyes carried a cold, calculated danger. "Miss me?" Scarface sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Clara turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "I was wondering when you'd come back," she said, her tone as even as if she were greeting a customer. "You've got a lot of nerve, lady," he growled, stepping closer. "Humiliating me like that in front of my crew. But this time, it's not just my crew. I brought reinforcements." The men behind him spread out, their boots thudding heavily against the floor. Scarface leaned on the counter, a wicked grin stretching across his face. "You should have taken my offer when you had the chance. Now, we're not just here to take your bakery. We're here to make you pay." Clara didn't flinch. She didn't back away. Instead, she calmly untied her apron and folded it neatly, placing it on the counter. "Funny thing," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You keep talking about this place like it's yours for the taking. But you don't understand something important." Scarface raised an eyebrow, his grin faltering slightly. "Oh yeah? And what's that?" Clara stepped out from behind the counter, her movements smooth and deliberate. "This isn't just a bakery," she said. "And I'm not just a baker." In one fluid motion, Clara reached into the drawer beneath the counter and pulled out a small, sleek device. She pressed a button, and the shutters on the windows slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. The bikers cursed, their voices overlapping in confusion. A moment later, dim red emergency lights flickered on, casting the room in an ominous glow. Scarface's grin was completely gone now, replaced by a scowl. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. Clara didn't answer. She moved like a shadow, her figure barely visible in the dim light. The first sound was the sharp thwack of a baton hitting its target. A biker yelped as he was disarmed, his weapon clattering to the floor. The second sound was a low, guttural groan as another man was taken down with a swift, calculated strike. Clara's true self had emerged, a warrior, a tactician, and a force to be reckoned with. The bikers, who had thought themselves invincible, were now the ones scrambling for escape. But there was no escape. Not this time. The chaos had barely settled when the sound of sirens began to pierce the quiet of the evening. The bikers, still sprawled across the bakery floor, groaned as they began to regain some sense of awareness. Their leader, Scarface, sat slumped against the counter, his face bruised and swollen, his pride battered as much as his body. Clara stood near the door, her stance calm and composed as always, her apron now streaked with a mix of flour, sweat, and a few traces of the confrontation. The emergency light still flickered softly in the background, casting a red glow over the room that felt almost surreal in its stillness. It had only been minutes since the bikers had tried to intimidate her, but in that brief time, Clara had dismantled their threats one by one with a skill that made them feel powerless. The sheriff's car pulled up outside the bakery, its lights flashing brightly, casting long shadows across the pavement. Clara didn't move as the officer stepped out and approached the door. She knew this was at the moment when everything changed. The sheriff, a burly man named Deputy Harris, had worked in Willow Creek for over 20 years. He knew everyone in town by name, and he had a reputation for being fair and patient. But there was something in the way his eyes widened when he saw the scene inside the bakery. "What in the world happened here?" Deputy Harris asked, his eyes sweeping over the tied-up bikers, who were now groaning and trying to free themselves. Clara stepped forward, the door creaking softly as she moved. "They came to make trouble," she said simply. "But they won't be bothering us anymore." The sheriff raised an eyebrow, looking from Clara to the bikers. His gaze softened for a moment, and he let out a long breath. "Well, I can't say I'm surprised," he muttered under his breath. He turned his attention to the bikers, his tone hardening. "You boys are in for a long night. Not just for the damage to property or the threats, but for the trouble you've caused in my town." The bikers, who had been silent until now, began to growl and curse under their breath, but none of them made a move. They knew, deep down, that they had lost. As the sheriff began to take statements, Clara stayed at the edge of the room, quietly observing. She didn't speak much. There was no need to. Her actions had already spoken louder than any words could. She watched as the sheriff untied the bikers, one by one. Each man had his head hung low, and the leader, Scarface, was no exception. His bravado had evaporated the moment he realized he wasn't dealing with an ordinary baker. "You know," Deputy Harris said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully as he looked at Clara. "I always thought you were just a quiet woman, baking pies and serving coffee. Never realized you had it in you to take on a bunch of thugs like this." Clara didn't respond right away. She simply watched as the bikers were handcuffed and loaded into the back of the sheriff's truck. Her heart remained steady, her focus sharp. "I don't like trouble," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "But I'll do what needs to be done when it comes to protecting this town, and what's mine." The sheriff gave her a long look, as if trying to figure out if he had misjudged her. Slowly, he nodded. "Well, I think it's safe to say I won't be underestimating you again, Clara." And with that, the bikers were taken away. As the sheriff's car disappeared down the street, the townsfolk began to gather outside the bakery. Word had spread quickly, everyone knew what had happened, and they couldn't believe their eyes when they saw the bikers being driven off in handcuffs. The townspeople, who had once thought of Clara as nothing more than a quiet, unassuming baker, were starting to see her in a whole new light. They had always admired her baking skills, her kindness, and her gentle demeanor, but now, they saw the quiet strength that had been hidden behind her soft-spoken nature. One by one, the people of Willow Creek approached the bakery, hesitantly at first, unsure of how to greet Clara after everything that had happened. Mr. Thompson, the farmer, was the first to step forward. He removed his hat, tipping it in respect as he looked Clara in the eye. "Clara," he said with a warm smile, "I don't think I've ever been prouder to call you a neighbor." That was something to see. Clara smiled back, her expression softening. "Thanks, Mr. Thompson," she replied simply. "But I don't want any special attention. I just did what needed to be done." Mrs. Hargrove, who had been one of the first to gossip about Clara's skills, was next. She clutched a warm pie in her hands, offering it to Clara as a gesture of thanks. "Clara, I'm so sorry for all the rumors I started. I never thought you had it in you, but I see now that I was wrong. Thank you for protecting all of us." Clara nodded, accepting the pie with a grateful smile. "No need to apologize. What matters is that we're safe now." The townsfolk continued to gather, each offering their gratitude in their own way. Some brought flowers, others baked cakes, and still more simply offered kind words and silent appreciation. As the day wore on and the sun began to set, Clara found herself standing at the door of the bakery, surrounded by the people of Willow Creek. The town, which had once looked past her quiet presence, now saw her for who she truly was, someone who had fought for them, someone who had protected their home. And Clara, for the first time in a long while, felt a warmth in her heart that had little to do with the ovens or the smell of fresh bread. It was the warmth of respect, of understanding, of being seen for who she really was. As the last of the townsfolk filtered out of the bakery, Clara took a deep breath, looking at the quiet street outside. The storm had passed, but there was still a lingering sense of change in the air. She had always been underestimated. People had thought her quietness made her weak, her unassuming nature made her an easy target. But now they knew Clara Harper was not someone to mess with. And as the sun dipped lower, casting its final golden rays over Willow Creek, Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her. The battle was over, the town was safe, and she had earned something more valuable than just respect. She had earned the right to live her life, her way. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room was the one with the most power. And those who underestimated her had learned that lesson the hard way. Clara stood at the threshold of her bakery, the warm golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows over the small town of Willow Creek. The streets, which had once felt so quiet and familiar, now seemed different. They were still the same peaceful streets, lined with neat homes and cozy shops, but something had changed. It wasn't just the absence of the loud, rude bikers who had caused so much trouble. It wasn't even the way the townspeople now looked at her with a new respect. No, it was something deeper. Clara took a deep breath, inhaling the comforting scent of freshly baked bread that filled the air. The warmth of the bakery embraced her, as if welcoming her back to what she loved, what had always been hers to protect. As she stepped back inside, the familiar rhythm of her world returned. The gentle hum of the oven, the soft shuffle of flour on the counter, and the quiet rustling of pastry dough. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed at all. But everything had changed. The people of Willow Creek had learned something that day, something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. And Clara had learned it, too. It wasn't just that she had protected her bakery, her town, and herself. It wasn't even just that she had taken on a group of dangerous bikers and come out victorious. No, it was much more than that. Clara had shown everyone that strength doesn't always come in the form of loud voices or flashy displays. Sometimes, strength is quiet. It's steady, like the dough she kneaded every morning, like the way she held herself in the face of fear. It's in the small, deliberate choices you make every day to stand firm, even when no one else believes you have it in you. The townsfolk had never really known her. They had seen the quiet baker with her apron and soft smile, and assumed that was all there was to her. But in the silence, in the hours spent alone with her thoughts and the warmth of the bakery's ovens, Clara had become something more. Something powerful. Something they hadn't seen coming. And that was the lesson they all needed to learn. As Clara looked out the window of her bakery, her eyes catching the last traces of sunlight before the evening shadows crept across the streets, she thought about the people who had underestimated her. She thought about the bikers, their mocking grins and their loud voices, their belief that they could walk all over her. They had been so sure of themselves, so certain that they were the ones who would control the situation. But Clara had been waiting. Not just for this moment, but for any moment when someone would mistake her quietness for weakness. She had always known that her true strength lay in patience, in preparation, and in the quiet power of knowing who she was and what she stood for. She had known, deep down, that if the day ever came when someone would try to challenge her, she would be ready. Not with words, not with anger, but with the steady certainty that she could face whatever came her way. The townspeople who had once whispered about her, who had once seen her as just a soft-spoken baker, now saw her as a force to be reckoned with. They respected her, not because of her victory over the bikers, but because they realized that the strength they had overlooked for so long was the very thing that had kept them all safe. As the sun dipped lower, Clara wiped her hands on her apron and looked around the bakery, content. The quiet had returned, but it was different now. It wasn't just silence, it was peace. And in that peace, she found something more valuable than anything else, the knowledge that no matter how quiet, how unassuming, how underestimated a person might be, they can still hold power. True power doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be announced. It simply is. Clara walked to the back of the bakery and took a seat at the small wooden table, the one she'd often used to jot down new ideas for pastries, or to rest after a long day of kneading dough. She let out a soft sigh, looking out the window at the calm, starry sky. The world felt so vast, so full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine what else was possible. The world had underestimated her for so long, and now, it was her turn to show them what she could do. There was more ahead. She could feel it. It wasn't about fighting or proving something to anyone. It was about knowing her own worth. And that was all that mattered. The next morning, as Clara opened the bakery, she noticed something different. It wasn't just the way the sunlight streamed in through the windows or the way the smell of fresh bread seemed to carry a little more weight in the air. It was the people. They were smiling more, greeting her with newfound warmth. They weren't just customers now. They were neighbors, and they saw her differently just as she saw herself differently now. When Mr. Thompson, the farmer, came in for his usual loaf of bread, he didn't just say hello. He paused for a moment, looking Clara in the eye, as if trying to say something more. He held out a small bouquet of wildflowers, freshly picked from his field. "For you," he said with a smile. "I've learned a lot from you, Clara. I thought you were just a quiet baker, but now I see you're a lot more than that." Clara took the bouquet, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," she said. "I'm glad we've learned something new." And it wasn't just Mr. Thompson. Throughout the day, people came in with small gestures, flowers, handshakes, or just a friendly word. The town, which had once viewed her as a background figure, now saw her as someone they could rely on. Someone with strength, courage, and a quiet wisdom. As the day drew to a close and Clara locked the door to her bakery, she reflected on everything that had happened. It had been a strange, difficult time. But now, as she stood in the calm of the evening, she felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with the quiet of her shop. It came from the knowledge that she had made a difference. That, Even in the silence, she had stood up for herself and for those she cared about. And that was something no one could take away. Clara had learned, too. She had learned that her quietness didn't mean she lacked power. She had learned that it wasn't the loudest or most forceful people who made a real difference, it was the ones who stood firm, no matter what. The ones who knew their worth, who carried their strength quietly, and who never needed to shout to be heard. And as she turned off the lights and walked toward the back of the bakery, she smiled to herself. The quiet ones, the ones who are overlooked and underestimated, are often the ones who hold the sharpest edges. They are the ones who can make the most noise when the time is right, and the ones who will always stand strong, no matter what.